conversation about yesterday's worship at White Rock United Methodist Church.
We talk about what caught our attention, stories we forgot to tell, and ways that we saw the Holy Spirit moving among us.
Well, I feel like that's a lot longer.
Dramatic, very dramatic.
If you can't tell, if you're watching with us live on YouTube or watching this later on our YouTube channel or Facebook, we have a much longer intro because Dexter got a hold of this production-wise, and now there's actually like cool video rather than just our faces like beat bopping back to the music as it's playing on the intro. So
yeah, you're losing that effect if you're listening to us on just regular podcasts, you know.
Well, I mean, it's regular podcasts are so 2019. Everything's on YouTube now.
Oh, buddy, how are you?
Oh man, pretty good. Pretty good. I'm real bummed. If anybody watched the Sunday sit down yesterday, I was wearing my Broncos ugly sweater, and the Broncos couldn't quite pull off the upset of the Chiefs last night. So I'm just like a little bit sad about that, but it wasn't
disappointed.
It's fine. Everything's fine. Actually, I don't really care that much.
Who was playing quarterback for him last night?
Mr. Drew Lock was back after his COVID issues, so they actually had a quarterback. They didn't have to pull anybody off the practice squad this time.
That's good.
It's good. Yeah. Anyhow, you doing all right, buddy?
Yeah, I'm good. We're we're moving right along here through Advent. So if you missed yesterday's worship, no shame. There is an opportunity for you to catch up. You can find it on our Facebook page. You can find it on our YouTube channel. You'll find various parts of the worship service, kind of spliced and cut up and sent back out to you, and bite-sized chunks. However you want to engage with worship, we want you to find what works for you. But we were, we continue this series, Joy in the Midst of Darkness, and it is, a series that I think is appropriately timed as we try to figure out how do we find joy in the midst of this year. And it's a challenge, I think, because of how heavy everything feels and how off-kiltered everything is.
I think we've talked about it, but I think maybe it's worth revisiting that so much of what I read and when I see people talk about light and darkness, and I don't think darkness is an uncommon theme in the midst of Advent. I think people approach it fairly regularly, but it's almost always approached with this idea of, but yet there's light at the end of the tunnel kind of mentality. Like there's always this kind of dichotomy. And I know we talked about week one, this Barbara Brown Taylor book and her invitation to, I think you talked about in your first sermon of the series too, this idea of befriending the darkness.
Right.
And I just think it's a really uncommon approach in the midst of all of the noise around darkness versus light kind of thing. And it's a move past just like dualism that we've talked about some too. But I think it's worth spending a little bit more time reflecting on that, because there's just so much talk of like, we're going to get through this. Like there's a vaccine coming. Like it's just so like we're in a lot of darkness, and we don't just allow ourselves always to sit with that darkness. We almost like force ourselves out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is in some ways, I think it's a luxury for some of us to say, hey, let's sit in the darkness because we can handle it, because we have the resources needed. On the other side, I think like learning that the darkness is always around is really important. Like there is no way to insulate us from feeling the heaviness that the darkness can create. But you're right, like darkness is not inherently bad, and we have to like move away from the like light dark dichotomy, I think, and recognize that Advent every year is a season of darkness and preparation. That's why we light candles, right? I mean, like it is a reminder that that Christ is birthed into this kind of dark world, and even Christ's birth happens, in darkness. Not only just because it's night, but also because the stories tell us that it happens outside the light or power of empire. too, right? So on the edges, and I think that when we recognize that story calls us back to the darkness as a friend, to be reminded really good things happen in the midst of darkness is important, because we can move so quickly to Christmas morning, where there's, you know, whatever it is Christmas morning looks like, Christmas tree and light up toys and yummy warm food and
Right.
hopefully some sun shining over a snow covered backyard, right? But
Yeah.
truth is, darkness happens every year in Advent, and it's more of a appreciation of that than anything else.
Yeah, it's good. I'm enjoying the aspect of that from this series, and I think it's been a good thing to approach from a standpoint of worship, and it just helped me kind of reflect on my Advent journey in a little bit of a different way too. So
yeah, and I really appreciate Rebekah's calls continue to do a really good job of setting the scene of how do we befriend darkness, how do we see it as a companion and not a foe, and she does such a great job of writing that. Those liturgies, particularly the calls in Advent, are a little longer, a little more poetic, and I think thematically it's a little more heady and a little more esoteric than maybe some of the other series we've done, which poses challenges, I think, for all of us trying to boil it down to something that can be used and appreciated and heard and consumed in that way. But she does a really good job of setting the scene. And so if you weren't watching worship, you don't know this, but Rebekah and her husband Jeff tested positive for COVID-19, and so they are at home recovering, quarantining, doing all the good things necessary to stay healthy and get healthy and stay safe. And so she's not with us this morning on the podcast. She pre-recorded a lot of her music as she started to feel bad before she got a positive test. So she had a lot of foresight there, and was able to get some stuff recorded for us on Sunday earlier last week. And as I said in my sermon, we kind of took a hatchet's not a precise enough word, a scalpel to worship, and did a lot of pre-recording on a lot of different days, and then we give it to Dexter to stitch back together, and he did a great job doing that. So worship will probably feel, our hope is that it doesn't feel any different, but it may feel a little different over the next few weeks as we try to keep going, but also keep everyone safe.
Okay, so I always feel, so often you and I and usually Rebekah and even Dexter, whenever we're in the midst of it, worship feels very different because we're in the midst of kind of making it happen or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What did you feel energy wise from the service, having it been pre-recorded like that, and then being on the other side like this? Because we've been really intentional about trying to be as live as possible. Yeah. Where a lot of churches have been pre-recorded, and we've kind of had that conversation too. But did you feel like there was a different energy yesterday, or?
I not really. I mean, outside of it, just obviously not having as many people involved in worship in the sanctuary space, I think that became evident. But no, I it's hard to say. It always feels a little different watching worship at home when you've participated in worship. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, yeah, I think we're probably not the best people to ask because we've already gone through it once, and so we've already experienced it, and so it's kind of a re-experiencing of worship in some ways. But I would be interested, does it feel different having it pre-recorded versus live? I see my mom says no.
Yeah, your mom says the energy feels the same on this side of the screen, which is good. And I don't know if it's just because I was, able to pay almost more attention because I wasn't trying to make sure everything's moving in the way that it's supposed to in the midst, and kind of the heat of the moment feels like the weird word, but I don't know. So it felt very different for me, and I'm not sure I can put words to why. So I was curious if you were feeling the same thing or if it was just me. I was looking for solidarity.
Well, yeah, definitely, right? I guess we just have to trust that in the midst of all of this, like worship is still a time that's set aside by folks at home.
Sure.
And it's still a time that we're setting aside, although in chunks during the week.
Yeah.
And we enter into that time prayerfully, trusting the Holy Spirit is leading and guiding us. We hope that happens and translates to whatever is produced on
Sure.
Sunday morning. And I think that's the most we can do, right? There's just no perfect way to handle these types of situations. And it being Advent, I think, is particularly challenging because this is one of the seasons, like Easter, where it just doesn't feel the same. You can't replicate that feeling of the sanctuary being all decorated and candles being lit and seeing folks who come into town, and like, you just can't replicate it. So I think the challenge is, do we expect ourselves to be able to replicate that or do we lean into the fact that this is just how it is? And I think we've done a really good job of leaning into it and still trying to do our best with what we have, right? And that's really key. And I think it's a real testament to our church. Like, I think everyone's staying engaged and doing the best that they can, and because of that, I think that we are being blessed by a particular faithfulness that is being demonstrated by our congregation and by our staff as we move through this dark time and in this winding journey towards Bethlehem.
Yeah. So the Isaiah text that we read this Sunday was not this text, and I can't remember if we read it last week, but it's the comfort, oh comfort me text, or comfort, oh comfort my people.
Right.
So my friend from Virginia Theological Seminary, Sarah Stonecipher Boylan, she is doing this deal called Advent Word, where it's a different word each day, and today was the word comfort. And it took me back to this idea of comfort and like this challenge that we're in right now to figure out, like, if the text in Isaiah, it's an imperative in the Hebrew, right? Like, and what I learned in Old Testament was that, like, it's an imperative of like a plural imperative, like y'all, like we would say in Texas, right?
Yeah.
Like, y'all comfort my people. And I think our challenge is in such darkness that we're in right now, like, how are we as the church going to respond to one another to comfort our God's people, right? Which there's a lot to unpack there, right? Like, who are God's people? Well, I would probably argue everyone's God's people. And like, who is the y'all directed to? Well, it's also kind of directed to everybody, but like specifically in the Isaiah text, it's to the people Israel,
right?
And
it's very specific in who it's addressed to,
sure,
and very broad in who the recipient
should be
that comfort, right? And if we as a church are going to look at that text and and ponder it, it is hey, White Rock, comfort my people, while we also comfort one another, right? Totally. I think like that's the key, and that requires us extending a lot of grace to one another, and because God extends it to us, but we need to extend grace to one another in the way that this Christmas is not going to feel like last Christmas.
And I'm seeing it even like in the Facebook chat or during worship, like the conversations that happen between people there are like really like touching to me, that it feels so intimate, and in some of the ways people welcome one another in that space. And it's almost like they bump into each other in the narthex and are having this conversation about something that happened yesterday, but it's just happening in a Facebook chat. And,
right.
I think pre-pandemic, nobody would have ever thought that there would be any comfort in that space. So I don't know. I accept the challenge of what does it mean for y'all comfort my people in the midst of a global pandemic, where technology really is having to be the space that we use and the tool that we use to go and comfort one another. Mm-hmm. And it may not be the comfort that we're used to. Here's the cliche, right? But maybe it's the comfort that we need right now,
yeah.
And I know that's a challenge, but it's also like, it's giving us an opportunity to be really creative in the way that we approach the rituals that we have so often leaned into that we don't get to do in the same way right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's not ideal to have communion like we celebrated communion this past Sunday.
Right.
The good news is that
good example.
Communion is still celebrated, right? And Um, outside of apparently everyone said I look like a monk that was wearing a black hoodie. And I guess it was really evident when I put on a white stole. Anyway, I'm down with that. I'm down with the monk look. Like maybe I should just start wearing more. What are they called? Not robes. Monks have.
Is it a cassock? Is that the word?
Maybe. Yeah, I need to go back and.
I have a white one.
Dust up on my liturgical wardrobe terminology. But anyway, having said that, what I love about it is it's something that we kind of bumble around, and like it's not perfect, and like I don't know how to like really preside. I'm not comfortable presiding over communion online. Like
right.
It's but it doesn't matter. It's not about our comfort level. It is about like, can God's grace still be articulated and experienced in these digital spaces and in the moments of lack of confidence? And then the resounding answer is yes. We see that in Scripture over and over and over and over again, right? I mean, God is showing up in the midst of like anxiety and fear and struggle and incompetency and in Mary, right? Like, think about the transformation that must have existed in Mary's life, going from unknown, probably underappreciated, unwed girl to this prophetic voice that we see in Luke, which is the text, right? Like God's choosing to show up in these moments, and because of that, like we trust that God's continue to show up in these moments, and who knows where that will lead us.
Right. No, it's such a beautiful and powerful text, and it hit really well for the week. What were the things that you wrestled with the most as you were working through the text to prepare a sermon around it?
I mean, I had the worst time writing the sermon. Like, I don't know if it was my own fatigue or my own frustration that, like, I don't know if this was a week where I was like, this is not how sermons are supposed to be preached into microphones that are into cameras, right? Like, I need people around me. I don't know if it was a text and just feeling overwhelmed by what direction we take it, but like I had the hardest time writing it. And I think that what I finally settled on was it was actually, I read a bit of commentary about this idea of the incarnation, and I didn't spend a lot of time here, but it being the root word for flesh, like carne being the word there for flesh, and then also carnival. And it was this idea that that the absurdity of Jesus's birth and the manner in which it takes place is much more of a statement about God than we would like to give credit to, and it's this idea that the absurdity leads to this unbridled kind of singing out. And before we make really large theological claims about the incarnation, we have to like feel it, feel the absurdity of it. And so this person was writing about essentially all the carnivals that took place in medieval Europe around Christmas. And it was essentially a whole week of lampooning the most powerful people. They would elect their own bishops, and they would do these, like, they'd have these carnivals where like all the like poorest folks in the land were the ones like marching in the parades and like getting the food at the end. And like it was trying to like embody this upside down world. Wow. And I think we see that some like in other carnival cultures, right? In New Orleans, in
Brazil,
right? Like it's this idea that that we can't really get to the heart of the matter until we recognize how I'm trying to find the right word, how we can't really get to the heart of the matter until we recognize how absurd it all is.
Sure.
Right? Like,
which is so like beyond it's beyond an intellectual
like understanding or appreciation. It is how do we embody that? And that takes us to a whole nother level.
Which is so fascinating, because when you think of, like you said, carnival, and like there's not a lot of people who are doing a like deep theological, like intellectual dissect on the experience of carnival. Well, there went my lighting.
There's a Phil's
Apparently,
like hardest time with his
my Lumina Cube stickiness has gone away. I'll just
you know,
hold my lighting like this.
get a command strip.
It is 2020. It's fine. Yeah, like, but people are celebrating Carnival for the like you said, the carnal, the experience of that, right? Like not the intellectual, and it should just make us shift a little bit when you bring this attention to Advent, that we spend a lot of time in the church specifically thinking about Advent and like, what does it mean? And like doing the intellectual side of it, but like, what are the experiential things we're being invited into as well with this? And like,
and I think that's what we can mourn, because I think it's hard to recreate that over a screen. The touch of bread, the tactile experience of communion. I know we can have that at home, but you know, it being handed to us. I think it's the senses being like the sanctuary looking different, although we try to make it look pretty. We don't necessarily buy into the whole like, let's just make it look ridiculous. But you know, like just the subtle things that we take for granted, I think are ways that we can shift our thinking. Like sanctuary looking different isn't just so it can look pretty, it's to like help us reorient ourselves to the story. Like, you know, like the idea that there are trees inside the sanctuary, like that should get us to a level of like past, oh, that's pretty, to, what does that really mean? And like, what does it mean that I can like think about wreaths being hung, or like, you know, if we were a you know, tradition that burnt incense, like some of these things that I think are to wake us up out of the routine are really hard to translate on screens, because now what we're doing is we are taking worship in whatever form or fashion we're consuming it, and we're like letting it be a part of our routines.
Right.
At least that's how we do it at our house. Like Cash is still doing whatever Cash is going to do. And I'm still like getting coffee or making breakfast or making lunch, really. And, you know, so I think there's this idea that out of the convenience of it all, which is awesome,
sure,
celebrate it, there is this lack of differentiation between worship and Advent and the world we live in, and that's hard to replicate.
Yeah, it is hard to replicate. Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's just this huge challenge for us who are kind of called to lead the church, right? To invite people into that and to find a new way, and like you said, differentiate and kind of a way to interrupt all the noise of what the monotony and like the repetitiveness that we experience kind of day in and day out.
Yeah.
Whew. Man.
So you do it because you wear a Broncos sweater.
The fact that I didn't have a change of shirt and had to continue to wear the Broncos sweater for the announcements was pretty fantastic. I can only imagine how distracting and confusing that was for people who didn't experience this when they sit down and they tuned into worship and they're like, why is Phil wearing a ridiculous Broncos sweater? So
the best part about that was, I mean, your sweater did play in. It wasn't the deciding factor, but we were like, can you really preside over communion in that sweater?
Totally. And we made the call.
The answer is yes, you can.
Yes,
you can. But, you know,
it might have been a little distracting.
I think it's, you know, as Mom points out, albs, right? You know, I think the alb approach to communion is a far better one.
Yeah. No, that's fair. That's fair. Now, was there anything else in worship that really stood out to you? I'm looking at our bulletin from yesterday, and
I always like it when I always like listening to Josh pray. I think he does particularly good job crafting pastoral prayers, and so anytime I get to hear Josh pray is a blessing for me as a pastor and just as a, you know, fellow sojourner with the congregation on this thing. And you know, it's always good to see the folk band. It's in some ways there was nothing, while it all might have been stitched a little bit differently and kind of put together a little differently, it still felt like White Rock Sunday morning at White Rock, and that's what I really appreciated. You know, it's just this consistency with who we are, and that really comes through with the liturgy and the candle readings, and they all represent kind of an identity that we believe we've been given, because of our faithfulness to the Spirit and where we're moving. So this identity is kind of hyper local, but also hyper authentic, and so in a lot of ways, I thought worship was great yesterday.
Yeah, I just really love that we have the opportunity to pull people in. It was the McNeils doing the statement of faith, and it was
Beck and Mandy.
Yeah, and their kiddos was awesome at the end when he was like, "Yeah, amen." Like, I mean, there was just, you're right. Those are the things that kept it feeling like White Rock to me, and even like Lisa and Sandy doing the call to worship, I just love that we still get to have voices of our whole body, right? Like, it's not just a couple of us here, but and a lot of that comes back to Rebekah's really great advanced planning and Dexter's ability to pull it all together and, like you said, stitch it together. Like, it was just really good to be able to, even though we're still so distant from one another, to see one another and get to hear and to get to do this worship experience together and not feel like it's it's a collective thing still, and I love that so much.
Yeah,
so
and
really glad for that.
I don't have favorites in the congregation, but I would say like I really love Carmen brings so much to me as a pastor in terms of the questions she asks and the points she makes in the Bible study. But also when I hear Carmen read scripture, I tend to pay attention just because of her presence and who she is. And so, I don't have favorites, but Carmen is one of my favorites, right? And so
shout out Carmen.
So, and I think like we're seeing ourselves reflected in our worship, which is ultimately the biggest reflection of God and God's work in our community, right? And so it's not about us; it's about God and what we've come to understand about God and where our place is in God's continued story. And so I think that just is it makes my heart happy when I can experience worship like that and see the people I love reflecting the gospel back to me, and that's why we do it, right? That's why we wake up on Sunday morning and go to worship is so we can have that touch point, that intersection with the divine and this in our normal lives, and hopefully feel the continued pulling of the Spirit for us to live holy and justice-filled lives.
Totally. Yeah, I know I've said this a couple times now, but I really do appreciate this series, and I think it's been really good. And I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to reflect on it, and even this podcast, like it's helpful for me to go back and revisit and think through and process through all of it. And Dex is throwing up wrumc.org for more information, right? Like there are other pieces and things that we do. You mentioned Bible study, right? And I love that we get to sit with a handful, 10 of us that get together on Wednesday mornings and really process through when we read through the Magnificat earlier this week, like last week, it was just, these are really good things for my soul that continue to give me like a little bit of a balm in the midst of all of this. And I'm just super grateful that we have this connection,
Absolutely.
I miss like everybody being in person so much, but I'm still really grateful that we have these connection points, and that it's not just something that we throw on a screen and consume on Sunday mornings and then that's it, right? But there's really these great conversations that happen in the chat, and there's really these other touch points that we get to have each week. And so I think that's been one of the most meaningful parts for me this Advent, and making me kind of recalibrate myself in the midst of all of it.
For sure. Good news is we got a couple more weeks of Advent left.
Yeah.
And if you haven't caught up, there's plenty of time to catch up in the series. Next week, we continue with Advent 3 and some more beautiful music, and continue kind of searching for this thing. And you can find all that on wrumc.org/online. So, friends, thank you for listening, Phil.
Yeah.
Great job. Sorry about the Broncos.
I mean, their season's done anyway. It's fine.
I can't wait to watch a Cowboys game on Tuesday.
Right. It's weird also.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Y'all, thanks for joining us this morning.
Take care.
Yep. See you soon.
Bye. You're listening to a podcast recorded at White Rock United Methodist Church in the heart of East Dallas. For more information, you can find us at wrumc.org. And make sure you stay subscribed to this channel to stay up to date with all of our content.